Throughout the island world of the Pacific, scattered men of many European races and from almost every grade of society carry activity and disseminate disease. Some prosper, some vegetate. Some have mounted the steps of thrones and owned islands and navies. Others must again marry for a livelihood. A strapping, merry, chocolate-coloured dame supports them in sheer idleness. And dressed like natives, but still retaining some foreign element of gait or attitude, still perhaps with some relic, such as a single eyeglass, of the officer and gentleman, they sprawl in palm-leaf verandas and entertain an island audience with memoirs of the music hall. And there are still others less pliable, less capable, less fortunate, perhaps less base, who continue, even in these isles of plenty, to lack bread. At the far end of the town of Tahiti, 3 such men were seated on the bench under a purao tree.
I don't think I ever wanted to be anything other than an artist. I don't remember wanting to be anything else except a rock musician like all teenagers, but I was absolutely hopeless at that, no talent there. So after that, kind of in my late teens, I just drifted towards art. Before that I had a kind of idea that painters or being a painter was something that old people did. You know, it wasn't cool like being in a rock band. So, but I drifted towards that, and by my late teens I decided I wanted to be an artist. So I studied painting and sculpture in Spain, then I studied theatre design in London at the Slade School. And this is an MFA in theatre design, and they'd give you a book or they'd give you a piece of music and they'd say, okay, do something visual for this. And this just kind of fitted straight into my mentality. And that's been the way I've been working. I get a piece of music, I get a piece of literature that suddenly catches my attention, and I research, I start looking into it, and then I start to translate. I think this idea of translating is quite, kind of makes sense with my life and with being bilingual and thinking and living in 2 languages. So I translate things that are in a book. I'll try to translate them into painting or sculpture or a piece of music. And this is the way I work. In this case, I'm kind of working a bit like an illustrator in the sense that I'm getting certain moments of the book which I found really interesting. But then I want to transcend the actual image. I start off with an image, like a guy in a dinghy boat rowing for shore. But then I want to transcend that with the language of painting. See, for me the language of painting is about poetry and music. It's not just about creating an illusion of an image, of something that's going on, or a landscape, or a person, or whatever, but actually using the way it's painted to create a feeling that's related to the image that you're painting. You can recognize what's going on, like there's a boat, or there's a beach scene with some palm trees and that, but it's painted in a strange way that's trying to use the actual language of painting to make you get the feeling of what you want to portray. And that I want to transmit not by illustrating what's going on, but by the way I'm using the paint. Visual languages I find are really difficult to say something in an explicit way, but they're very effective for creating feelings in the viewer. And this is what I find interesting in painting, and what I'm always looking for, is the poetry and the musicality as part of the language. My dad bought me a copy of Stevenson's Treasure Island when I was a child. Must have been 8, 9 years old. I remember I was fascinated by it, I loved it. I read it over and over again, like Jim Hawkins and Long John Silver. It's all part of my childhood. So a couple of years back I wanted to do the same thing with my children. So I bought this like standard copy of Treasure Island. My children didn't seem to be as fascinated as I was when I was a kid. And the thing is, quite by chance, it happens to include another story, which is the ebb tide, and thinking it was going to be something similar to Treasure Island, and it's also a ship and an island and the South Seas and everything. I started reading, and all of a sudden I was hit by this story, which is definitely not an adventure story for children. It's something completely different. It's It's like, it's humanity at its worst. 3 white men on the beach in Papeete, living down and out, actually literally living on the beach, each one of them with a pathetic story behind them that's brought them to this terrible situation. One of them happens to be a ship's captain who's responsible for the death of many people because he's a drunkard. And he's offered to continue the journey of this schooner that's come into port after losing most of its crew who have died of smallpox. This guy, Davis, he accepts the job and he brings along his friends, Hewish and Herrick, with the plan to steal the ship's cargo of champagne and then sell it together with the ship, with the vessel, in Peru. Once they set sail, they spend most of the time drunk until they realise that they're actually victims of a fraud because the cargo of champagne is actually bottles of water. So in the middle of this crisis, they sight an unmapped island and there they discover this guy called Atwater, who's an Englishman who's harvesting pearls, and he's also a religious fanatic. So the 3 of them devise a new plan, which is to kill Atwater, take his pearls, but this guy Atwater's immediately suspicious of their intentions, and he ends up killing Hewish and converting Davis. Herrick, nonetheless, is left in some kind of nihilistic limbo. You never know actually what he's thinking or what his plans are. So by the time I realised that this book was about colonialism in itself, I had that moment that's happened to me many times before, like with music and with literature. This is going to be one of those things I'm going to do a project about. I've been a Stevenson reader and lover since I was a kid, but I'd never read this Stevenson's latest novels, like The Beach of Falesa and The Ebb Tide. And I did this a couple of years back, and I was hit by something completely different.
Yeah.
And so since then, I've been on a quest to find out what The Ebb Tide is really about. I know this is a difficult one like that.
I think the question is unanswerable in a way, because Stevenson, it's offering you possibilities of meanings, but no final one. It's a bit like a visual art, you see. I mean, work of visual art doesn't have a sort of meaning you can express in a sentence.
Absolutely,
yeah. So if I offered you a sort of an interpretation of it, it would really be undermining his whole artistic project, I think.
Okay.
That's a way of not answering, you see.
That's the way of answering. So what you're saying is that it's just offering kind of reality bites
no, it's offering sort of the insoluble puzzle of life, really, a moral problem. I think I wanted to arrange the world in dichotomies: positive, negative, good, bad, alive, dead. You know, all these dichotomies, and so we're always trying to do that. And that's what, as you get into that last part of the book, you're trying to sort of sort it out. But then he just kind of takes the carpet away from under your feet and makes it difficult for you. You can't say that Atwood is positive and virtuous and the answer. You know, he isn't.
Yes. Well, this is a key question, of course. I think the ebb tide is somehow related with Treasure Island in the sense that it begins perhaps or opens at the moment when Treasure Island ends, in a sense. What I have in mind is the image of the three Maroons begging for God's grace or mercy. And as you know, at the end of Treasure Island, this mercy is denied. They are left to perish probably on the desert island. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, the ebb tide opens on the similar image of the three beachcombers being left stranded on the beach of Tahiti.
Okay.
And of course, as you know, they embark on a rather wild goose chase or adventure. Mm-hmm. They have this cargo of champagne, which work as some sort of treasure. So we have the reworking of the treasure motif in both cases, in both novels.
Do you think the ebb tide could be considered as an expression of a change in political thought at the end of Stevenson's life, after having travelled to the South Seas?
I don't know if it is a real change as far as Stevenson's attitude towards colonialism, for instance, is concerned. I think his final stance, or his political stance at the end of his life, is obviously critical of European rule, which tends, as he puts it, to carry not only activity but also to disseminate disease. The French rule over Tahiti meant the dissolution of the traditional Tahitian way of life. And I think Stevenson was extremely critical of that in his final years. Somewhere down the line, even if we're not alright, I'm sure it will be fine tonight. Unless storm strikes the moon.
I know this isn't an easy question, but what is the ebb tide really about?
It's about a lot of things.
I know, that's a lot.
It's partly, I think, looking towards a tradition that's very, very much established with Joseph Conrad, but I think it anticipates this notion that the empire is not full of pure-blooded white Englishmen with the romantic spirit and their heroes and the chivalrous, and they're really out there to help the native people and bring them to the light and all of this kind of thing. I think by the time Stevenson got out to Polynesia and South Seas, he was seeing things that really debunked the whole myth about empire. And the ebb tide is partly about that. He was writing, by the time he got to Samoa, he was writing political letters to the Times and such like back home about what was happening in Samoa and other parts of Polynesia. And he was being criticised by people like Sidney Colvin for spending too much time with what Colvin called his chocolates. Okay. And Stevenson wrote back and, is defending them. So he's very much on the, if you like, sympathetic with the native peoples.
Yeah. And what were Stevenson's politics? This isn't easy either, but in Claire Harmon's biography, she defines Stevenson as a Tory.
Yep.
And says he always was till the end of his days. So he was an upper middle class Scotsman, so that would be his natural place to stay in politics. Did he change his mind in general, politically?
My PhD student, who's working on Stevenson was at Edinburgh the other day and came back to us and said, "Oh, did you know I can prove it? Stevenson was a card-carrying Tory. His signature is in the book. He was a signed-up Tory."
That's so.
Out in Samoa, who knows? He may well have changed his politics. He may well have done it. But then he was also supposedly an agnostic, and yet later in life he was writing, I think it's some psalms, some hymns, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So he's quite a dual figure.
Jekyll and Hyde.
Yes, exactly.
All the way through.
All the way through, right.
What's the Ebb really about?
Okay.
Okay.
I would say it's about the evils of colonization, evils of empire building, because the ebb tide has very much to do with the Aeneid, Virgil's Aeneid, because when you think of it, the protagonist is an Aeneid fiend. He is a complete destitute, and the only thing he's got left with him is a copy, a tattered copy of the Aeneid.
Yeah.
And he writes his own epitaph, which is an extract from the Aeneid. Anything he looks at, even though he is in the tropics, reminds him of the Aeneid, because he was educated as was the case in 19th century. You knew about those
classics,
texts, that's
yeah.
right. But when he looks out at the island we can see out there, Moorea, what comes to his mind is a quote from the Aeneid. When he sails into an atoll and sails through the pass, he is reminded of the Aeneid. And what is the Aeneid about? It was a text that was commissioned by a Roman emperor in order to justify his position as an emperor, and it was laying the foundations of the Roman Empire. In retrospect, this emperor wanted to make sure that his origins went as far back as the original founder, Aeneas. So it is about tracing the origins of this emperor back to Aeneas. And I think that Stevenson, because he knew everything about the Aeneid, and actually the only book he had with him in Tahiti while he was in Tautira was the Aeneid and a Latin dictionary. So while he was staying there and getting the feeling of Tahiti, he also was reading and rereading again and again the Aeneid. And it may have ended up in writing this book because it also takes place in an atoll. It takes place in Tahiti and on an atoll. And it's about how the first place, Papeete, has been metamorphosed by Western civilization. In other words, by empire building. So I think that the first part of the book portrays in a very negative way what a tropical island has become as a result of Western presence. And then the characters sail away, and there are many references in the book to the fact that they are sailing back in time too, sailing back to the past, because this boat they have, the Farallone, is a repeat of previous voyages that were made by Wiseman and Riceheart, for instance. They make the same mistakes, they have the same crew. It's also a repeat of the former boat which the captain had, where he drowned people. So you can see that many things refer to the past, and it may be extended as far as saying that the Farallone sails back to the past and maybe to the origins of Western settlements in the Pacific, because the place they land to on this atoll looks very much like early settlements, because the man who lives there is Atwater, and he presents himself as having a mission, and he also says that he came for business, and obviously he also is a political ruler. So he may well be the epitome of the first colonizers.
Atwater's all three in one.
I would say
He's
so.
the authority, he's reaping the riches, and he's imposing the religion.
Because he has a pearl farm.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I would say that it's a tale about the making of an empire, and having a look at the results first, and then sailing back to the sources, see how it was made. But always in the background, it seems to me that there's this reference to the Aeneid, because there are lots of cross-references you can find in the book itself.
So it could be described as an Aeneid of the British Empire?
Yes,
Or
except
European
that it
empires in
ends in a
general.
quite different way. The ending is
Okay.
is quite different.
Yeah.